Okay, just for a little refresher here. Last night we ended in chapter 9 of Daniel. We saw Daniel's intercessory prayer for the nation, for the release of the captives there in Babylon. And it was at the time that Media Persia had taken control of the kingdom. Daniel knew from the writings of Jeremiah that 70 years had been fulfilled. And it was time for the release. Jeremiah had prophesied that they would go into captivity for 70 years. So you see his national prayer of repentance, and he acknowledges God's justice and everything that had befallen them. It was a prayer that was in time with the sentence that had been decreed upon them. So it was actually the prayer of Daniel that had brought about, I am sure, this release. And while Daniel is praying, he's visited by the angel Gabriel, and Gabriel gives him an understanding of what is yet coming. Yes, there's going to be a release and a restoration, a partial restoration anyway, but history is going to repeat again because Jerusalem is going to again reject the prophet, in fact, the greater prophet than Moses. They're going to reject Christ. Again, Jerusalem is going to be devastated, and there's going to be future judgments that will lead them to their final redemption and ultimate restoration. If I made that clear so far. Okay, so Daniel is given an understanding of 70 unique weeks of years. A week of years is 7 years. 1 week is equal to 7 years. So we're talking about 490 years that were determined upon Israel to ultimately bring about their redemption and restoration. And these years are broken into increments. It's not just 490 years, but they're broken into increments. So the exact number of years is predicted from the decree to release the captives in 457. Well, actually, it wasn't to release the captives, but to restore Jerusalem. And it was exactly 483 years from this decree to the Messiah. It was exactly. I mean, he prophesied exactly from the time that this decree was made until the Messiah would be 483 years, 69 weeks. So Daniel is then told that the Messiah would be cut off. So, I mean, this is phenomenal. I mean, the Messiah would come at a certain time and he would be cut off. And after that, the prince would come and destroy the city. And of course, that was Titus in 70 AD. And that was followed by many miseries right up until, the 48 generation. And then Daniel is brought to the final week. There's one more 7-year period of time to complete the redemption of Israel. And so we're taking a jump from the 1st century AD to the end of the church age. We're taking a jump, and we explained that yesterday. And during this final 7-year period, the Antichrist makes his debut. And in the middle of this last 7 years, he commits a sacrilege in the temple known as the abomination of desolation. Puts his image in the temple and, of course, causes the sacrifice to cease. Or perhaps, as Antiochus did, he offers up a swine, which was an abomination to the Jews. This begins the Great Tribulation, and when this tribulation period is over, Israel is restored. They pay double for all of their sins because of their rejection of the Messiah. And they're pardoned, and they enter into the new covenant at that time. Any questions about that? That was chapter 9 of Daniel. Okay, picking up in chapter 10. And just to give you an overview of chapter 10 gives us an excellent picture of spiritual warfare. Now, in this chapter, Daniel and his friends, company, are praying, they're fasting, they're denying themselves of pleasant food. And as we shall see, they're being resisted by certain powers. They're fallen angels that are resisting them. The prayer was heard in heaven from the time they started, but there was certain powers that were keeping the answer from coming to them. They're dealing with angelic forces. So this chapter kind of gives us a picture of gives us a picture of spiritual warfare, but of principalities that govern certain territories, certain boundaries. When boundaries change on earth, there's been a change in the heavens. And Satan has the power, he's the god of this earth, to appoint certain of his hosts over certain areas. And in fact, revival never comes until those principalities are dealt with. But we'll talk about that a little bit more. There's competition amongst the host, the fallen ones. In fact, that's why they followed Satan to begin with, was because they wanted something. Okay, let's look at verse 1. And you know what? I'm not getting good light here, and I'm going to wear my glasses tonight, I think. I don't like to wear glasses. Daniel 10:1. In the 3rd year of Cyrus, king of Persia, a thing was revealed unto Daniel, whose name was called Belteshazzar. The thing was true, but the time appointed was long, and he understood the thing and had understanding of the vision. So the 3rd year of Cyrus brings us to about 533 BC. Verse 2, in those days I, Daniel, was mourning 3 full weeks. I ate no pleasant bread, neither came flesh nor wine in my mouth, neither did I anoint myself at all, till 3 whole weeks were fulfilled. And in the 24th day of this first month, as I was by the side of the great river, which is Hiddekel, and just let me interrupt there for a second, because this fast has come to be known as the Daniel fast, just eating healthy food and denying all pleasant food, but just enough food for nourishment and to sustain their health. And Daniel gives the location as being by the river Hiddekel. Today we know the river to be the Tigris River, which flows through present-day Iraq and into the Persian Gulf. Actually, he was in the Persian Empire at this time. Okay, going on to verse 5. Well, actually, I don't want to read those verses. But in verse 5 through 11, Daniel is visited by an angel. And when you see the description of this angel, you would think that it was Christ himself. I mean, it's a powerful angel. It's a dazzling angel. But it's not Christ, because he's fighting with the principality in the heavenlies. And if it was Christ, he would need help from another angel. And as you see, he's going to return, and another angel is coming to help him fight with this principality. So this is not Christ. Christ does not need help from an angel. But, when you take a look at this angel that appears to Daniel, it has all the appearance of Christ. And we're also going to discover from this account that this heavenly battle must have been of some duration, because it concerns a change of empires. And, as we'll see, this Persian Empire is going to diminish, and the Grecian Empire is going to take over. And this really didn't take place for almost 200 years. So this battle must have gone on for a while in the heavenlies. But again, there's competition among fallen angels. So let's drop down to verse 12, Daniel 10:12. And the angel is speaking here. Then said he unto me, Fear not, Daniel, for from the first day that thou didst set thine heart to understand and to chasten thyself before thy God, thy words were heard, and I am come for thy words. But the prince of the kingdom of Persia withstood me 21 days. But lo, Michael, one of the chief princes, came to help me, and I remained there with the kings of Persia. This prince that withstood this angelic visitor was not a human prince, it was a fallen prince. And there are princes over certain areas, and once in a while, people have their eyes open to see these fallen principalities. In fact, I remember a story Pastor Bailey said one time, and he was on a train, and he was going through, I think it was Thailand. It was one of those Southeast Asia countries. And he was noticing that everybody in this region were wearing little black pointed hats. All the inhabitants, of this region, which looked kind of strange to him. But then his eyes were open, and he saw this principality, this huge angel standing over this area. And he said, and this fallen angel had a hat. Had a black pointed hat, just like the ones that they were wearing, the people of the land were wearing. Of course, they didn't see the angel, but that's the kind of influence these principalities exert. Okay. So this angel is being resisted by this principality of Persia for about 20 days, but then Michael, another angel, comes and helps, and he arrives to Daniel's side. But Daniel was heard from the moment he began to pray, but the answer was resisted by, fallen powers. They were resisting heaven's messenger. Okay, everybody clear on that? But throughout the world, there are territorial boundaries, and every time there's a change of boundaries on earth, then something has happened in the heavens. And revivals never come until some of these principalities are dealt with. I don't know if you've ever read any of the accounts of the Welsh revival, but there were certain key individuals that were praying for revival in Wales. This is going back to the turn of the last century, early 1900s. And one of the key players here, one of the ones that was renowned in this revival, had the privilege of binding this angel. And in fact, the name of the book is called Spirit Over Wales. But when this angel appeared to him, he saw a golden cord coming down from heaven, and he took this cord and bound this angel with 7 cords. And that power was broken and was taken down, and revival came. Tremendous revival for about 5 months. In Wales, the whole nation was transformed. But we have to realize the God of this world, little g God, has power to give certain dominion to some of his minion, certain of his host. And of course, God allows this too. In fact, as Paul says in 2 Corinthians 4, whom the God of this world has blinded those who do not believe. And back during the time of Hudson Taylor, everybody know who Hudson Taylor was, missionary to China, late 1800s, early 1900s. During the time of the Boxer Rebellion, you know what the Boxer Rebellion was about? It was the nationals rising up against the foreign influence. And so they They wanted to kill all the foreign missionaries, and they killed something like 50,000 foreign missionaries in China. Hudson Taylor escaped that because he had adapted the customs of the Chinese. He had his hair in a braid. They wore Chinese clothes, and somehow they escaped all of that. But because they rejected the gospel, God gave them over to another spirit. And so you know what they got, of course. They got communism. When people reject the truth, God gives them over to another spirit. And that's what happened in China. When people reject the truth, then they get a lie. They get something else. So these principalities can only be dealt with in the will of God and through intercessory prayer. And I think we're all aware of another little incident that happened in New Zealand, because in New Zealand they were praying for revival. This was back in the late 60s, early 70s, in that era. And Pastor Bailey happened to be there at that time, and there was actually two angels, huge angels as high as this room, that came in to where he was staying, and they knew their time was up, and they knelt down, and he put his head or his foot on their head or their necks, and they were destroyed and taken down. And great revival came to New Zealand. They did all kinds of miracles there, even walked on the water and everything else. But this chapter gives us a little insight into spiritual warfare. We're not fighting with flesh and blood, as Paul said. We're fighting against principalities and powers. And when we talk about principalities, we're talking about angelic princes. Okay? Any questions at all on that? Okay, let's drop down to verse 18. Then there came again and touched me one like the appearance of a man, and he strengthened me, and said, O man, greatly beloved, fear not, peace be unto you, be strong, yea, be strong. And when he had spoken unto me, I was strengthened, and said, Let my Lord speak, for thou hast strengthened me. Now again, this is not the Lord himself. It's an angel. It's small l. My Lord, let my Lord speak. Because he's going to return and fight with this principality. And as I said, the Lord does not need any help from an angel to fight. In verse 20, and we could make a point on, O greatly beloved of heaven, because there's not another person in Scripture that is referred to like that. In fact, 3 times in the book of Daniel, you find this little phrase, that he was greatly beloved of heaven. And so Daniel was not an ordinary person. Okay, in verse 20, then said he, Knowest thou wherefore I come unto thee? And now will I return to fight with the prince of Persia, and when I am gone forth, lo, the prince of Grecia shall come. And as we said, it was really a considerable time, from the 3rd year of Cyrus, until the Grecian Empire had the dominance. We're talking about almost 200 years, so this must have been a long struggle up in the heavenlies. But when kingdoms change upon earth, something has happened in the heavenlies. And when God's people intercede upon earth, something is going on in the heaven. I remember one prayer meeting we had here a few years back, and we were downstairs and we were all praying on a Wednesday night. And Frank had his ears opened up, and he could hear swords clashing in the heavenlies. He could hear a fight going on in the heavenlies, and actually you can find some scriptural references to back that up. But when people are really interceding here, Something is taking place up there too. I don't think people are aware of the spiritual forces that govern the earth. Okay, let's drop down to verse 21. But I will show thee that which is noted in the scripture of truth. And there is none that holdeth with me in these things, but Michael your prince. Michael is an angel. He's one of the archangels. And he is actually the prince over the nation of Israel. He's Israel's prince. So let me make another point about territorial boundaries. Because oftentimes, I don't know if you're that sensitive like this, but even sometimes crossing a city line or county line or state line or from country to country, you feel a change in the spirit. You can feel it when you change, even going out of the city. As soon as I drive out of Erie into Mill Creek, I feel a change. I feel light. My mind opens up. I feel charitable thoughts coming, and then when I come back into Erie, I get mad again, and I'm angry with, everything that's going on. I leave the city again. Everything lightens up. But I want to tell you a story that Ralph Mahoney told. Now, you folks know who Ralph Mahoney was? World Map Missions. He had some pretty good camp meetings on the West Coast. But he was telling a story about some missionaries that were right on the border of, and I'm not sure, but I think it was Paraguay and Uruguay in South America. And there was a street that divided Paraguay and Uruguay. So the street divided two countries. And these missionaries, when they were on one side of the street in one country, they tried to hand out tracts and invitations. Nobody took one. Nobody was interested. On the other side of the street, everybody took a tract, and everybody accepted an invitation. And even those who had rejected a tract on this side of the street, when they crossed the street, they took it on this side of the street. It just shows you, the powers that be. That's why, we're really dealing with the spiritual world. And if we're ever going to see revival come here, we've got to see something broken. Yeah, I never forget that story, but I think that says it all, doesn't it? Yes, sure, go ahead.
Phenomenal churches, basically all over the world, they've never did this kind of teaching. They are never aware that there's anything ever going on besides this world.
Yeah, I know. That's true. Well, thank God for the truth then. Okay, chapter 11. Let me give you a little overview of chapter 11. It's considered one of the most difficult chapters in the Word of God. Most commentators say it is the most difficult chapter. You could spend a whole 8 classes here if you wanted to get into the historical content that you find in this chapter, chapter 11. However, we're going to try to brief it up to make our deadline here. We always get through on time. I time myself, and sometimes I feel rushed. I like to spend more time on certain subjects, but I can't if I want to cover all the material. But in this chapter essentially gives the historical account from the succeeding kings of Persia into the Grecian Empire. And then the Grecian Empire is divided into 4 sections. Alexander's 4 generals. Remember, the kingdom was divided up after Alexander died. And so there were 4 districts, north, south, east, and west. And then 2 of these particular empires, the Seleucid Empire, which was Syria, and to the north, was in constant conflict with Ptolemy, the Ptolemean Empire in the south. And so you see these 2 kings warring, king of the north against the king of the south. And basically it's from these 2 empires and their offspring, because it went on for about 150 years. You know, there was intermittent periods of peace, and even there was a marriage there that they hoped would pacify some of the, some of the strife, but it didn't. But there was a continual feud between these 2 until you get to a fellow that we've mentioned earlier on, who comes out of the Seleucid Empire, and his name is Antiochus Epiphanes IV. You find him in the book of Maccabees, 2nd Maccabees. But the Seleucid Empire was, I don't really know. I mean, I'm not really clear whether Alexander split the kingdom up. I would really doubt that he had a part of this. But these 4 generals, maybe between themselves, split the kingdom up. And anyway, we're just basically looking at these 2 empires. And we've covered who these generals were before, so I don't want to get into that. But anyway, they're waging war for about 150 years. And so when this chapter mentions the king of the south, we're talking about Ptolemy and the future, his dynasty. And the king of the north, it's Seleucus and his offspring, and they were battling and coming through the Holy Land. You know, the Seleucid Empire was in Syria, Ptolemean Empire was in Egypt, and of course the Holy Land is in between, and so they would rampage through Palestine, in some of their battles. So, as we have mentioned before about Antiochus Epiphanes IV, he is a figure of the Antichrist. He's not the Antichrist, but he's a figure of the Antichrist to come. So, picking up here in verse 1, 11:1. Also I, in the first year of Darius the Mede, even I stood to confirm and strengthen him. And this chapter would fit closer to chapter 9. Year of Darius. And judging from verse 2, the I here would be the angel. I stood to strengthen him. As we see in verse 2, and now I will show thee the truth. Behold, there shall stand up yet 3 kings in Persia, and the 4th king shall be far richer than they all, and by his strength, through his riches, he shall stir up all against the realm of Grecia. And actually, this 4th king is Xerxes. He's the most powerful one, and he's going to stir up the Greeks. He goes against them. They had million-man armies, and he's noted for sacking and burning Athens, which stirs up later offspring of oh, good heavens. Not Philip. Anyway, it was Alexander who is the one who wants revenge. But anyway, I'm getting ahead of myself here. This fourth king, Xerxes, he's rich, he's powerful, and he stirs up the Greek Empire. Verse 3, and a mighty king shall stand up that shall rule with great dominion and do according to his will. And this is Alexander the Great. And when he shall stand up, his kingdom shall be broken and shall be divided toward the four winds of heaven. Here again is the splitting up of Alexander's kingdom. He died when he was 33. The kingdom was divided to the four winds, to his four generals, Cassander and Ptolemy and Seleucid and Lycomedes. Shall be divided toward the four winds of heaven, and not to his posterity. Alexander didn't have any offspring. Nor according to his dominion which he ruled, for his kingdom shall be plucked up even for others beside those. So, your manual, your book makes things clear if I've missed something here. But there are four successive Persian kings mentioned by name. The last one is Xerxes. He stirs up the Greek Empire. And as I said, he's notorious for burning Athens. Then a mighty king stands up from the Greek Empire, which is Alexander. And he was short term. Conquers Persia and most of the known world in just a short time. He was never defeated. But at his death, the kingdom is divided to the four winds, north, south, east, and west. Or his four generals, as we mentioned, Cassander, Ptolemy, Seleucus, and Lycomedes. Lycomedes. I don't know if I pronounced that right, but I'm sure he'll forgive me. The two that we're most interested in here are the Seleucid Empire and the Ptolemaic Empire, because throughout this chapter, these are the two warring factions. And this is where Antiochus comes from, and he is a figure of the Antichrist. Okay, in verse 5 through 20, we see this back and forth conflict for about 150 years of time. And, there are times of peace here. And as I mentioned, there's even a marriage that comes about in the hopes of pacification, but doesn't last very long. But this whole time period is very complicated, very well explained in your manual. But I want to drop down to verse 21 and zero in on one particular character, which we have mentioned, who emerges from the north. And this character is Antiochus. We saw him earlier. Antiochus the Fourth, and he was called the Little Horn in that chapter 8. But this man gives us a picture of all the characteristics of the Antichrist. So, dropping down to verse 21. Boy, we seem to be making time tonight. Maybe I should be reading more of these verses. I don't know. Verse 21, and in his estate shall stand up a vile person, to whom they shall not give the honor of the kingdom, but he shall come in peaceably and obtain the kingdom by flatteries. Now this is a vile person, Antiochus. He's a part of the dynastic family, but he's not heir to the throne. He somehow usurps the throne through subtle means, and he obtains the kingdom by flattery. Now, again, because of time factor here, we're going to focus in on certain traits of this Antiochus and some of his wicked deeds because they foreshadow another person who's coming, who is the Antichrist. And notice he comes in peaceably. Now, if you take a look at this word in the original language here, it not only has a sense of tranquility, but it has a sense of prosperity. And this fellow he gathers a lot of wealth, and so not only is he wealthy, but he scatters that wealth to those who join with him. But he is a flatterer, and that is mentioned several times. He makes people feel good. He disarms people with his feel-good message. And as we consider the characteristics of the Antichrist, we see how it carries over into the church, because the spirit of Antichrist will be in the church at the same time, and even some of today's prosperity message is a good example of how the enemy obtains the kingdom. It's a message that circumvents the cross, and it draws crowds. You know, the prosperity message never preaches the cross. It's not a cross that you have to bear. But the spirit of the Antichrist makes people feel good message, whitewashes sin, message of tolerance, unconditional love. It's a message that takes away the fear of God. You won't see in any of these big mega churches, most of them, you won't see the fear of God there. I mean, because they're disarmed about, you can't lose your salvation. God loves you no matter what, all that kind of stuff. But you can see how that spirit is alive today in the church. In fact, John says that in his epistle that the spirit of Antichrist has been working from the beginning. But the main thing is it's taking people away from the message of the cross. It circumvents the cross. It tells people you can jump from Egypt into the promised land without going through the dealings and without going through the wilderness, and you don't have to change your life. But in verse 23, it says, "And after the league made with him, he shall work deceitfully, for he shall come up and shall become strong with small people." Now, notice the kind of people that are attracted to him. Small people. Now, there's other interpretations to this word, small. But I believe that small of character would probably fit the best. People that don't really have convictions in their life, don't really want to take the way. In verse 24, he shall enter peaceably even upon the fattest places of the province, and he shall do that which his fathers have not done, nor his fathers' fathers. He shall scatter among them the prey and spoil and riches, yea, and he shall forecast his devices against the strongholds, even for a time. Well, he seems to control money. He lavishes his wealth on his cohorts, those who are with him, for a time. Human nature is vulnerable. It's like Satan said, skin for skin. Man will do anything to save his own hide. But the same with becoming wealthy, or we're coming into a time at the very end when you're either going to have to compromise or it looks like you're going to come up short. In fact, he has a certain control over nations, as we see it in Revelation. If they don't buy in, why they can't buy, they can't sell. And people sell their soul, or something like that. It also seems from some of these verses that the Antichrist does not have universal control. He's going to affect the nations, but there are passages that kind of indicate that there are nations that resist him, probably the sheep nations. They're going to be affected. Their commerce is going to be affected by not buying in, but I believe there are certain nations, especially sheep nations like America, hopefully, and Britain, for some of them that don't buy in and resist him. Anyway, in one of Antiochus says crusades against the south, he comes back with a great rage. It hasn't been a good battle, and he comes back and he ransacks. He rages through the Holy Land, and he persecutes many of the Jews. In verse 28, and actually Jerusalem is probably the epicenter of the Great Tribulation, and especially Jerusalem and Israel and the nations around, but there are other nations that he doesn't completely control. Verse 28, then shall he return into his land with great riches, and his heart shall be against the holy covenant, and he shall do exploits and return to his own land. Now, in the historical account, Antiochus, he comes back to Syria through the Holy Land. He turns on God's people with a great rage. And if you really want to probe into this, like I said, you have to get into the second book of Maccabees. It's an apocryphal book. You find it in the Catholic Bible. But it's not divinely inspired, but it's historical. And so you can find a good account of all of the atrocities that this man does, including, we'll get down to the abomination, desolation. But the Antichrist hates God's people. He's Antichrist, and he hates all of God's people. And he's allowed to overcome them for a season. It says he makes war with the saints. That's not Israel either. I mean, it is Israel, but the saints are the redeemed. 11:29, at the time appointed he shall return and come toward the south, but it shall not be as the former or as the latter. For the ships of Caram shall come against him, therefore he shall be grieved and return and have indignation against the holy covenant. So shall he do, he shall even return and have intelligence with them that forsake the holy covenant. Seems as though he conspires with the apostates, but with great rage against the holy covenant. And we're talking about the Jewish law. But you get the idea here that other nations do not all subscribe to this man, because certain nations oppose him. The ships of Caram come against him, and it kind of ruins his plans here. But remember, this man is only a figure of the Antichrist. He's not the Antichrist. He's just a figure. And then another thing that you have to note is that even though the Great Tribulation affects the whole world, again, it pretty much centers around the Mediterranean area and the nations around the Mediterranean, around Israel. Okay. I know it could take a lot of explaining for some of this. Everybody perfectly understand that so far? Yeah? Good. I get nervous when nobody asks questions, Okay, let's consider the abomination of desolation. In verse 31, and arms or forces shall stand on his part, and they shall pollute the sanctuary of strength, and shall take away the daily sacrifice, and they shall place the abomination that maketh desolate. So, abomination of desolation is a term that resounds to this day. Jesus makes reference to this in his Olivet Discourse. And you find the details of this, as we said, in the second book of Maccabees. Now, this madman, Antiochus, what he does is he takes an image of Zeus with his face on it. I mean, it's an image of Zeus. Actually, I've been by the temple of Zeus in Athens. It's still there. But he takes the image of Zeus and puts his face on the image and puts this image in the holy place in the temple. He thinks himself to be God. He wants to be worshipped. And anybody that doesn't worship, I mean, he tortures, he cuts their tongues out. I mean, the guy is brutal. And not only that, he tries to impose all of these Greek customs. He forbids any circumcision or any of the keeping of the law. I mean, the guy's a total madman, this Antiochus. And then he causes the sacrifice to cease, and he offers a swine on the altar, which is an abomination. And from that point, there's great persecution against the Jews. So this is something that has been, and yet it's going to be. This was a figure of something that's coming, because Jesus refers to this, the abomination spoken of by Daniel. He said, when you see this, then, flee. It's something that's future. It's something that has been, and it's something that's coming again, which tells us there has to be a temple, there has to be a return to sacrifice too. And that's clear from other scriptures as well. Verse 32, and such as do wickedly against the covenant shall he corrupt by flatteries. These are people that don't have convictions, and not only of the Jews, but of Christians as well. But the people that do know their God shall be strong and do exploits. And I think we could make an application here for the church. I mean, the lawbreakers, I believe a lot of lukewarm Christians will go for the Antichrist. In fact, that's the purpose of the Antichrist, because he's to take the tares out of the church. But it's the ones who do wickedly against the covenant, that's the lawbreakers, that are corrupted by flatteries. See, they're corrupted by the feel-good message. My sound dwindling here? Is it? It should be good now. Okay. They're corrupted by the feel-good message and the no condemnation message. But the people that do know their God, now simultaneously, I believe, and not only from here, but from other places, I believe that the greatest revival that the world has ever known is going to take place. And, we can magnify all of the bad things that are coming, but the church is going to end on a note of revival. It's a glorious church that goes up. The everlasting gospel has to be preached. The greater works of Christ have never been done yet. You know, Jesus said, you're going to do greater works than what I have done. Do you find anything in the book of Acts that is greater than what Christ did? Or even that can compete with the Old Testament miracles? No. But we have to see a revival at the end that's going to bring God's people back, and there's going to be a restoration of the church, and it's probably going simultaneously with what's going on here. They that do know their God. And verse 33, it says, and they that understand among the people shall instruct many. Yet they shall fall by the sword and by flame, by captivity and by spoil many days. And so there's going to be a great teaching ministry. There's going to be great miracles done, both sides of the fence, and great teaching. Verse 34, now when they shall fall, they shall be holpen with little help, but many shall cleave to them with flatteries. So there's not just the Antichrist, there are others that are in that groove as well. And also tells us that there's going to be some martyrdom here. Verse 35, and some of them of understanding shall fall, to try them and to purge and to make them white, even to the time of the end, because it is yet for a time appointed. So these few verses actually convey quite a bit. The greatest teaching ministry. You know, in Revelation 14, I have to preach a message on this sometime. You see an angel flying through heaven preaching the everlasting gospel. And it's at the end. Now, what is the everlasting gospel? The everlasting gospel is a gospel with no flaws in it. You know, some of these other gospels have serious flaws in them. They're not everlasting gospel. There's a lot of gospels being preached there. Part of it's right and part of it's wrong, but the everlasting gospel is the true gospel. There's no error, no flaws in it. And I believe the last day church is going to hear the true gospel, and those who love the truth will come to it. And yet, it says, and many shall fall. So, in the closeout of this age, God is going to purify His church through fire trial. And those who emerge will be part of the heavenly bride. And as I said, we're going to bring some of these things out a little clearer as we keep going here. What do we have? 4 minutes to break? I need 4 more minutes, Jane. Can I have 4 more minutes? Verse 36, and the king shall do according to his will, and he shall exalt himself and magnify himself above every god, and shall speak marvelous things against the God of gods, and shall prosper till the indignation be accomplished, for that is determined shall be done. So this fits into 2 Thessalonians chapter 2, where we see the Antichrist sitting in the temple. Paul said, when you see this man sitting in the temple, in fact, let me just read that. In 2 Thessalonians 2:3, let no man deceive you by any means, for that day shall not come, talking about the second coming, except there come a falling away first, and that man of sin be revealed, the son of perdition, who opposes and exalteth himself above all that is called God or that is worshipped, so that he as God sitteth in the temple of God, showing himself that he is God. Well, that tells you one thing right off the bat, that there has to be a temple before this age concludes. And as we mentioned the other night, been in Israel like 3 times last year. Didn't really plan it, but that's what happened. But there is a movement there for this temple to be built. There has to be a temple before this age concludes. And Paul says, when you see this man sit in the temple declaring himself to be God, that is something that takes place in the middle of the last 7 years. And then also in Revelation 13:5, I think we read these verses before. And there was given unto him a mouth speaking great things and blasphemies, and power was given unto him to continue 42 months, 3.5 years. And he opened his mouth in blasphemy against God, to blaspheme his name and his tabernacle, and them that dwell in heaven. And it was given unto him to make war with the saints, and to overcome them, and power was given him over all kindreds and tongues and nations. Going back to Daniel 11:37, neither shall he regard the God of his fathers, nor the desire of women, nor regard any God, for he shall magnify himself above all. This man is in love with himself, has such a God complex that nothing moves him. Like Alexander the Great, in fact, that's who will fit the bill here. He wanted to be worshipped more than anything else. He's the only one that could really fit the ticket here at the very end. He's somebody from the past, never been defeated. Alexander was a homosexual too. And these next few verses have a certain fulfillment. They've had a certain fulfillment. But you can glean from this account that this man is in control of a lot of money. Anyway, that's where we're going to have to conclude on this session. After the break, we'll climax the book of Daniel. Any questions at all on any of this?
Who was the king of the corruption and understanding the greatness of how to be worshipped? Was it Alexander? Or was it Antioch?
Yeah, it was, in this case, it was Antiochus Epiphanes. I mean, but he is a type of the Antichrist to come. But Alexander, he thought himself to be a god too. He wanted to be worshipped more than anything else. And as I think we mentioned yesterday, he's somebody who lived before John. John is told that he's coming from one of the first 5 kingdoms before Rome, in chapter 17 of Revelation. And the first 5 kingdoms that preceded Rome were Egypt, Assyria, Babylon, Persia, and Greece. And he's somebody who lived before John, and he had to come from one of those first 5 nations. And the whole world wonders after this man when they behold the man who was and is not and yet is. The thing is, the reason that the whole world wonders after this man is because he's recognized from the past. And I'm repeating myself, but if you saw an image from somebody from Egypt, King Tut, you wouldn't recognize him. I've been at the Cairo Museum here a couple of months ago. I wouldn't recognize any of these characters that I saw in the museum. And you wouldn't recognize anybody from Assyria. You wouldn't recognize anybody from Babylon. You wouldn't recognize King Cyrus or any of these kings. But when you get to the Greek Empire, there is almost competition going in Greece with images of Alexander. All kinds of images, and it's carved into mountainsides and everything else. And the whole world is going to wonder after this person, because they're looking at somebody who was, and he is not, but yet he is. he's alive. And so they wonder after this character, because he's somebody from the past. He's the only one that could actually fit the ticket here. Anyway, any other questions? Yeah. Oh, you never heard that? Well, Jesus said that when he comes, he's going to separate the sheep nations and the goat nations. The sheep nations are those who submit to the rule of Christ. Goats are of the rebellious nature. We used to have some goats. One particular goat we had was very rebellious. We used to call him Basham the goat. He used to break into our house, says Basham. The goats speak of rebellion. They're on the left, and the sheep are on the right. They're the ones who submit to the cross. The goats do not. So there are sheep nations today. You can sort out the sheep nations very easily. All of those that support Israel are sheep nations. All of those who hate Israel are not. They're goat nation. Okay? Any other questions? Okay, let's have a break here.